between them. So I'm going to start with a multi-page resume. Let me make sure that this is going to work out okay. So I'm going to switch my scene over to here. All right, so this is the multi-page resume, and this person did not anonymize it at all. So apologies to them for exposing their name and email and things like that to the general internet, but that is what that form is for. So let's dive in. So we got their name. They are a PHP developer. I like just putting I'm this type of developer. I'm a web developer. I'm a mobile app developer without saying like I'm a junior developer. I'm a senior developer. You don't have to necessarily call that out in your title. You're a developer. That's what you are. So make that your title. They got their email address up here. They got a GitHub link. They've got CodeMentor.io link as well. And these are actually all links. We can kind of see the little highlight down the bottom of the browser window. Showing that those links are going to work properly. And then they've got a pretty big sort of introduction, and then they've got a lot of work in the United States. So they've got New York, they've got California, and then they've got the UK, Belgium, other previous experience, certifications, and so on. So this list kind of goes on for a little while. Now, people in the UK, they use what they call a curriculum vitae, or CV. And a CV in the UK is going to be multiple pages. And generally what they aim for on that CV is like, tell me everything. They want to be able to read through this and get all of the information, or as much information about you as they can before they have to interview you. And so the CV is something where they actually want to see a lot of information. And so anytime you get a sort of a resume from someone from Europe, it's more than likely going to be many, many pages, and it's going to have like a larger summary. Some countries I've noticed are more likely to have like a headshot on there of some kind, and lots and lots and lots of information about them in that role. It's not 100% necessary to have all that information for the North American style resume screening. And jobs. And so the first question I would ask this person coaching them on like building up this resume is, are you looking for a job back in the UK, or are you looking for a job in North America? If you're looking for a job in North America, you need to trim this back down to one page. And that's going to mean taking some of the stuff off, and you can explain it during the interview. If you're looking for a job back in the UK, you may actually want to make this even longer. I've seen UK resumes that are like 8 or 9 pages long. Where it's literally every project at every job they've ever worked, every single possible skill and when they last used it. And so there's a big difference between like a European CV and a North American resume. And so I kind of wanted to show that contrast in here. All right, so let's dive in and look at this. So, I am this name. I'm a software engineer at this company with more than 7 years of experience. So, I mean, this almost starts to read a little bit like a cover letter. And again, with the CV, this is typical. You put a big like introduction about yourself on that CV. Vast experience in building robust, scalable, test-driven, performant web apps. I'm an advocate for TDD. Well, you already told me test-driven, and then you're mentioning TDD again. You've already talked about performance and scalability, which are best practices. Design patterns is kind of a generic term, but this sentence here feels pretty redundant. You've already told me a lot of this stuff already. Bouncing back up here for a sec. So I've worked with these companies in the UK, currently work for so-and-so in New York, help to build the application, and so on for nonprofit boards. Okay. I also write serverless functions, also capable of architecting database designs and building optimized SQL queries. So there's a grammar error here. There should be optimized past tense. I'm capable of architecting and building optimized SQL queries. So this is okay to put in as kind of a way to get started. But again, you got to be careful about grammar and stuff like that too. So now, the difference with the European CV, in my experience, so I've only screened a handful of these in my career. And so again, these are just my own opinions on this. When I look at a CV, I'm still trying to get at the same goal that I have when I'm screening a North American resume. Does this person have the skill that I need for this job that I'm trying to hire for right now? And so for me, I would want to see all of these skills that you've got on this last page. I would want to see all of this up on that first page, because that's the most important thing I'm trying to get out of this. If I got to go through page after page after page to find out whether you have that skill, I'm already less interested in reading through your whole resume, because you've made me go hunt for all this information. So as much as possible, you want to try to, I think, in my opinion, again, put these skills up on the first page. Maybe even the certifications. I would put the certifications up on page 1 as well. Let's see. Dota is saying in chat, Selenium and Cypress is not usually TDD. Yeah, I agree. I mean, well, yes and no. I mean, Selenium, you're really writing those tests ahead of time. And so you're writing the behavior of what you want it to do ahead of time so that it could run as a test. But it's actually running it in a real browser. So tools like Selenium, it actually pops up in a browser and you can actually see it clicking on things and dragging things around. It's actually pretty neat to watch. Or you could do what we call headless mode, where it's just doing it in a process in the background and it runs really fast because the browser doesn't actually have to render anything. But you can still kind of take a test-driven approach where you write that test and say, this is what I expect to happen. Now I'm going to make sure that test doesn't work. Now I'm going to go build the app so that test does work. So you can still take a TDD approach, but I also agree that in my experience working with Selenium, it tends to be testing after the fact. So you can kind of TDD the application, but then when you're building out those integration level tests, you can build them with Selenium to say, this is the behavior that we want to have happen, and you're more proving that this is actually what's happening in the application, as opposed to like a strict TDD kind of process. Let's see, if he's using those suites, I'd put behavior-driven development. Yeah, if he's doing TDD, I'd leave out those suites. Okay. Yeah, so everyone's going to have different opinions, but Dota, I appreciate you dropping that stuff in chat for sure. Hopefully this person that sent me the resume will read up on the chat here as we go. I will say it's a very small percentage of managers that know the difference. Yeah, I agree, and even less so for HR people. They may have some indication of, look for this technology, look for that technology, as guided by, folks in the engineering department. But it does depend a lot on the engineering manager and what their background is. If they've got a background as a developer, they're going to know that difference. If they've gone through like business school or something to get that management role, they're less likely to have that level of technical training. So yeah, you're right. Those folks would not know the difference, or less likely to know the difference. All right, well, let's get back to the resume here. So they got their career summary. They've got the first job here. Again, you'll hear me say this on the stream a lot. I'm not a big fan of these vertical bars to separate things. It does kind of interrupt your reading a little bit. And so I think that those are, those should probably just get taken out and leave it as either white space or put a comma in there. Till date, a little confusing. Does that mean this is like, to present date? I would probably change that and say like 2018 to present. But at the same time, like when you just say 2018, I don't know, was that like the end of 2018? And so you've got all of 2019, 2020, and most of 2021. So you've got 3 years experience. Or was this at the beginning of 2018 and now you've got that 4th year of experience because you've got all of 2018, 2019, 2020, and most of 2021. So there's a bit of a difference between 3 years experience and 4 years experience. And so I would actually coach this person, like put a month on there of when did you start at this job. Also knowing that you're a freelancer is fine too, but again, I would put months on here as well and just say, this is a present kind of role. Now they do write this in present tense. I mentor developers around the world. But a lot of the language up here is past tense. I managed this. I improved this. I built this, single-handedly drove. So there's a lot of past tense language. Actually, pretty much everything I'm seeing about their current role as this web developer role is all written in the past tense, where they're talking very clearly about present tense for this particular job. Now, if this was like, well, this was a project that I did at that job 2 years ago, then of course that's past tense if you're not still working on that project. And so there is some give and take in here that you can kind of consider as you're thinking about the tense of the language, present tense versus past tense. But try to just be aware of that as you're building that out. For me, again, bullet points should not wrap onto multiple lines. If you've got that much to say, I would break these into multiple bullet points. or I would reduce the number of bullet points completely and just not have this many bullet points. And I would, at best, what I would do is I would try to cut it off right around here. So right around where that date is, you kind of want to cut it off right around here. So if we kind of think about what happens then is these dates over here would kind of end up in a kind of a sort of column by themselves, because there wouldn't be any of this text underneath it. And so they stand out more. It's easier to see those dates. Now, they did put bold on the date, and so it does make it easier to kind of pull those things out, but there's a lot of overlap on here. Like, they started this job in 2018, and this job on the second page was also 2018. So did those overlap at all, or did one end and then the other one started right away? Or, you know, what if they quit this job in January of 2018 and they didn't start this job until December of 2018? Like, did they do anything that year? Like, was there other stuff that might have overlapped that? Did they do a lot more freelance work in that year? Like, so there's a lot of questions about the dates on here. So I would definitely put some months on here as much as possible, but I would trim up these bullet points. Now, this person has done a really good job quantifying information on here. You know, they reduced, you know, or they improved this by 80%, you know, or they, you know, improved overall loading time by 20, 50, etc. records by doing like some prefetching and so on. So they do a pretty good job quantifying some information on there. But I think, you know, bullet points don't have to be full grammatically correct sentences, especially for a North American resume. So I think you could trim up this text quite a bit. I'm also a little bit curious about the font size as well. The font up here for their contact information is a little bit smaller font than the content on the page itself. And the content of this actually feels larger than the content of the title and the name of the company. I would make all of this stuff one font size. I would make all of this like 10-point font. Now that's going to compress everything quite a bit, and it's no longer going to be 3 pages. It'll probably be 2 pages and maybe trickle into a 3rd page. But I think you could also like tighten up these skills a little bit too. We'll get to that in a little bit. So as far as like laying these things out, I would definitely shorten those bullet points. Again, for a North American resume, for a European CV, you do want to explain a lot of information in here because they are going to take the time to read the whole thing. There are aspects of it that they're just going to kind of scan over and screen over, but they're, you know, it's certainly not the 6-second to 10-second kind of timeline that a North American resume is going to have, like a human kind of scanning over it really quick. But I think you could still trim it up. Also, looking at the margins, looking at the bottom margin here, they're really pushing this bottom margin. Then the top margin on the second page is also right at the top of the page. I would probably add a little bit more padding around the edges of the page. Again, it looks like you've made those margins much wider to try to fit more content on the page. And that does make it a little harder to read, like scanning across the whole width of the page to read text that, especially that wraps across, is actually going to be harder to read. And then getting down to this last job at Belgium, again, they're doing a good job quantifying things, but a lot of the other same sorts of things would apply here. And then they list just a handful of other sort of previous experience, Nigeria as well. So they've got a handful of things in Nigeria. Now, from a white space point of view, and sort of how they've spaced things out, I would probably tighten the white space a little bit. Like, there's a pretty big gap in between web developer and the start of these bullet points. I would probably move that bullet point right underneath there and start these right away. And then when you get down to the previous experience, again, I think you could pull these like all the way up. But then there's not a lot of white space between this heading, which is all caps, and this heading, which is mixed capitalization and lowercase. If we come back up here, career summary is also mixed case. Professional summary is also mixed case. So why is previous experience all caps? So again, it's a consistency thing. Same thing with certifications. It's okay to list all of these different things, but be consistent about how you're writing it. So the first thing I would do, like if I had this in a Google Doc, I would just highlight all the text, make everything 10-point. And then I would go back in and I would make their name one size of font. I would make all of these titles, so their job title as well as all these headings, I would make them another size, and I would leave everything else the same size of font on the page. So generally their name would be like a 20-point font. This title and these headings, I would do like maybe 12 to 14-point font, and everything else, all this other content on the page, other than these other headers, would just be 10-point font. When it comes to the skills down here at the bottom, I would actually do, instead of these vertical lists with all of this empty space in between, I would find a way to make this a little more compact where you can still show the kinds of frameworks that you've used with PHP and the frameworks that you've used with JavaScript, but do it in a way that kind of groups them up a little bit better. For example, Node.js isn't a coding language, it's a framework. And so that needs to be put over here on this side. HTML and CSS, yeah, I mean, they're languages. Are they a programming language? It's debatable. ES6 is part of JavaScript, so if you're going to call out ECMAScript 6, I would probably put that next to JavaScript. And then if you want to list TypeScript on its own, that's fine. But are you doing like ES5 and ES6? So I would put both of those together. Also, MySQL is not a language, neither is AWS. So you're kind of grouping things in a strange way. AWS would actually belong under DevOps. MySQL I would also put under DevOps as well. And then a lot of the testing things you've got in here, like Selenium, Jest, Cypress, I would actually make another whole heading. Just, you've called out test-driven development in that summary at the very top. I would actually make a header just for software testing and list all of these things. And as Dota was saying in chat, maybe list behavior-driven testing or behavior-driven development in there as well. I think that could be beneficial too. Just checking chat again. Some of those bullet points seem like a day-to-day thing. Some of them seem examples of exceeding expectations. Yeah. I think it's still good to explain the day-to-day responsibilities, especially at jobs that they're currently at. So I think that there's definitely a balance to put in there, like maybe current responsibilities and previous projects or something like that. You can almost make like a subheader. Again, for these European UK or European CVs, you can add a lot of content that we typically would not include on a North American resume. And so you could make subheaders for the job and say, these are my current responsibilities and these were my previous, projects or previous responsibilities, things along those lines. So I think that, again, if it's meant to be a CV, they could do both. If it was meant to be like a North American resume, I would probably just list the projects on there and talk about the job when they actually get to the interview. Yeah, just going through, looking at some other stuff from Dota and chat about having a year gap on your resume. I think we talked about that the last time I saw you on the stream, Dota, where we were talking about like how do you handle that 1 year gap. Hopefully that was helpful. There were only 4 companies I was applying to in town. Yeah, so again, it depends a little bit on, are you applying for jobs only where you live, or are you applying for jobs remotely, and how do you kind of juggle that? ES6 is a weird one. ES 2020 is the latest one. Yeah, but if they haven't learned ES 2020, then you don't want to put something on the resume that they haven't had enough experience to actually speak to in an interview. So remember that as well. Anything you list on the resume is fair game. Anything on that you list as a language, as a skill, as a framework, as a tool, I should be able to ask you any kind of question about that. Now, if you only want to answer specific kinds of questions about it, then you can kind of frame that a little bit differently as far as your responsibility. Like if you list MySQL under DevOps, am I going to wonder, like, do you know how to set up MySQL, and you know everything about like setting up permissions and things like that, and like sharding and like replication and things like that? Or are you only a user of MySQL where you can create tables and maybe indexes and you know how to like fetch and save data? Because there's a big difference between those skill sets. So those would be things that I would probably specifically call out if I was going to list MySQL on a resume. Do I list that as like user level knowledge versus like operations level knowledge? And so I might call those kinds of things out a little bit differently. Like having Nginx under DevOps, that tells me that you know how to set up Nginx and you know how to set up the rules and the routing and things like that. Same thing with Docker. But when it comes to MySQL, like, are you just a user of MySQL, or do you actually know how to set up MySQL? So I think, again, you could probably group these skills in a different way to kind of get that point across there. All right, cool. So I think that's pretty much it for that resume review. The other thing that was a little confusing here is, again, they kind of switch over to this really tiny font. They start getting into really tiny font, and they do start mentioning months. But this font is a completely different size. And it also maybe looks like a different style of font as well. But you're also switching to a 2-column kind of thing where you don't really do 2 columns elsewhere. Like these are kind of 2 columns, but they're also very different as far as like where that column is split. Like when we look at these pages back to back, you know, this one kind of splits right down the middle. This one splits almost like a 60-40 sort of split as far as like the width of what these columns would be. So I think you could do a little bit better, you know, like put all these dates out on that right margin, similar to how you've done these dates out on the right margin. You know, I would just keep all the dates out on the right or something like that. So hopefully that'll help. And yeah, I think we'll call that one.